She walked out of this church as a wife. She made it 3 steps. The sheriff was waiting on the church steps with a warrant and a pair of handcuffs. Behind him, the man who had planned it all stood with his arms crossed, smiling. Her husband was arrested in his wedding clothes, and she had 3 days to save his life. But to understand how a woman with 17 cents and no name in this town ended up fighting for a man's life against the most powerful family in the valley, we need to go back 11 days. To the moment she arrived in a town that did not want her and discovered that the only person willing to help was the one person everyone else was afraid of. They walked out of the church as husband and wife. They made it 3 steps. The sheriff was waiting on the church steps with a warrant in one hand and a pair of iron handcuffs in the other. His face carried the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else on this earth but had a job to do and intended to do it. Silas Blackburn, I have a warrant here for your arrest. Cattle rustling, 6 head of Circle H branded cattle found on your land this morning. Behind the sheriff, a wall of faces. Garrett Hale standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes burning with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a trap close exactly the way he designed it. Mayor Ashford beside him, stiff and pale. Several ranchers looking uncomfortable but resolute. And a young man Lena did not recognize. Thin, weathered, would not meet anyone's eyes. Emmett Slade, 28 years old, a drifter who had sold his word for $50. Silas did not resist, did not shout, did not pull away or curse, or do any of the things an innocent man might do when the world turns on him without warning. He looked at Lena, and he said 5 words that were not a request, but a command born from love and forged in the understanding that what happens next will be decided not by strength, but by the appearance of it. Do not cry in front of them. Lena swallowed her tears. She pressed them down into the place where she kept all the other things she could not afford to feel, and she watched them put handcuffs on her husband's wrists. His wrists that were still wrapped in bandages from burns he had earned saving horses from a fire that these same people had set. She watched them lead him to a horse. She watched him ride away surrounded by armed men who believed or claimed to believe that the man who had given her shelter and safety and love was a criminal deserving of a rope. Garrett Hale rode past her close enough that she could smell his horse and his cologne and the particular scent of a man who believed his own righteousness the way a drunk believes he can still walk straight. You should have come with me when you had the chance, he said. Lena watched him go, and something changed inside her chest. Not anger. Anger was hot and wild and burned itself out like a brush fire. This was something else, something colder, something harder. The thing that happens to a woman who has been pushed past every limit she thought she had and discovers on the other side of all that pushing that she is not broken. She is forged. She had 3 days before the trial, 3 days to save the life of the man she had just married, and she already knew where to start, with the enemy's own daughter. But to understand how a woman with 17 cents and no name in this town ended up fighting for a man's life against the most powerful family in the valley, we need to go back 11 days earlier, to the moment Lena Mercer arrived in a town that did not want her and discovered that the only person willing to help was the one person everyone else was afraid of. A woman stood alone on a frozen street in a town where nobody knew her name. Willow Creek, Wyoming territory. November 1873. The sky was the color of old iron and getting darker by the minute. The wind came down off the mountains carrying the smell of pine and frozen earth and the particular emptiness of a place that had no intention of making room for one more lost soul. Lena Mercer had 17 cents in her pocket, a carpet bag clutched against her chest containing 3 dresses, a small cloth purse, a letter she had read 47 times, and a broken pocket watch that had belonged to a dead man she had never met. The watch had stopped at 3:47 in the afternoon. She did not know it yet, but that was the exact moment Thomas Hale died in a copper mine in Colorado, 6 months before she ever set foot on a westbound stagecoach. The exact moment the earth collapsed around him and buried the only future she had left. She would learn this later from a letter forwarded by the mining company delivered to a boarding house in St. Louis, where she had spent 2 nights sleeping in a chair because the bed cost extra, and every penny was a decision between survival today and survival tomorrow. The stagecoach that brought her here had cracked its axle coming into town. She heard it before she felt it. A sound like a rifle shot followed by the whole coach lurching sideways hard enough to send her carpet bag sliding across the bench and her shoulder slamming into the window frame. The driver cursed loud enough to scare the horses into a half gallop before he wrestled them still. Axle is cracked clean through, the driver said, spitting tobacco juice into the frozen dirt. We are done for today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe longer. Depends on the blacksmith. Depends on parts from Denver. Lena stood on the main street and calculated the way she had been calculating for 8 months. Every decision reduced to arithmetic. Every choice measured in cents and hours, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She had no money for a hotel. She knew no one in this town. Silver Creek, where her cousin Martha ran a dress shop and had written 3 years ago that there would always be a place for family, was still 2 days of travel away. That letter was 3 years old. Martha might have moved or married or died, but it was all Lena had. She had crossed half the country on the strength of those words, and she would cross the rest on whatever was left of them. The town stretched before her in a single line, weathered buildings with paint curling off in long strips, a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon where a piano played one key badly out of tune, repeating the same sour note like a toothache that would not quit, a blacksmith shop, a feed and grain supply, and at the far end of the street a white church steeple pointing toward a sky that offered no comfort and no warmth and no sign that anyone up there was paying attention. She tried the boarding house first. It sat on a side street behind a picket fence with lace curtains in the window and a hand-painted sign that read, "Rooms available. Respectable ladies only." The woman who answered was thin as a fence post with gray hair pulled tight enough to stretch the skin at her temples. Her eyes moved over Lena the way a butcher examines a side of beef. Fast, clinical, already calculating the value and finding it wanting. $2 a week, cash in advance. No exceptions. Lena opened her mouth, closed it. $2. The distance between what she had and what she needed might as well have been the distance between the earth and the stars. My stagecoach broke down unexpectedly, Lena said. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. If I could arrange to pay when I reached Silver Creek. Cash only. The woman's face did not move, did not soften, did not flicker with anything a charitable person might call sympathy. No credit extended. The door closed with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. Lena stood on the porch and felt something hard and bitter climbing her throat. She wanted to knock again, wanted to explain that she was not asking for charity, that she was a respectable woman who had simply collided with bad luck in a place that had no patience for either. But she knew it would not matter. The woman behind that door had made her assessment in 5 seconds, and nothing Lena said would change it. She walked back toward Main Street as the afternoon light began to fail. The November sun hung low and pale, offering nothing but the promise of a cold night arriving fast. Her mind raced through options. The church, the livery stable, the alley behind the general store, each one worse than the last, and all of them ending the same way. Alone in the cold with 17 cents and the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake coming west. The church door was locked. A sign read, "Services Sunday only. Reverend S. Whitfield." She sat down on the church steps and put her carpet bag in her lap and stared at the empty street and thought about how she had arrived at this particular moment in her life. 22 years old, 1,200 miles from the house where she grew up, sitting on the steps of a locked church in a town that did not know her name while God, if he was in there, had bolted the door. She thought about Thomas Hale, the man she had agreed to marry through a newspaper advertisement but had never once seen face to face. His letter was in the carpet bag. She had read it so many times the creases in the paper had worn soft as cloth. "I am not a man who is good with words," he had written in careful handwriting on cheap paper. "But I promise you a warm home and respect. That is all I have, and I give it freely." She had not answered his advertisement because she dreamed of romance on the frontier. She answered it because of Henry Phelps. Henry Phelps, her stepfather. A man respected in church and feared behind closed doors. He did not hit with fists. That was not his way. Henry Phelps controlled with silence, with locked rooms, with the removal of small freedoms one by one, until the walls of your life closed in so tight you could not breathe without his permission. And recently his control had shifted into something darker, something that lived in the way his eyes followed her across a room, the way his hand lingered when he passed her a plate at dinner, the way he stood too close and breathed too loud and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with kindness. Lena understood with the clarity of an animal sensing a predator that if she did not leave, the last thing she had to protect would be taken from her. So she ran. Thomas Hale was supposed to be her way out, a stranger in Colorado who wanted a wife and promised warmth and respect. Two things Lena had never been offered in the same sentence by any man alive. But Thomas was dead, killed by a collapsed mine shaft before she reached him. And Lena had continued west anyway because going back to Pennsylvania meant going back to Henry Phelps. And she would rather freeze to death on a street in Wyoming than spend one more night under that roof. She thought about the night she left. The memory came the way it always came, not whole, in fragments, pieces of broken glass that cut no matter which way she held them. Henry's hand in her hair, the window she had been climbing through carpetbag already on the ground outside, packed in secret 3 days earlier, his fingers closing around her braid and yanking her backward into the hallway, her hands against his chest, not thinking, just reacting. The desperate animal reflex of a creature cornered with nowhere left to go. The shove, the sound his body made hitting the stairs, heavy, rolling, boneless, all the way down to the bottom where the wooden floor met his skull with a sound she would hear for the rest of her life. The blood, spreading across the floor like something alive. The stillness, the silence that followed, thick and absolute, the silence of a house holding its breath. She did not check if he was breathing. She did not call for help. She went out the window and into the November darkness, and she ran. And for 8 months she had carried this image. Henry Phelps at the bottom of a staircase with blood pooling beneath his head. And she did not know if she was a woman who had escaped or a woman who had killed. The temperature dropped as the sun sank behind the mountains. Lena could feel the cold moving through her coat and her dress and settling against her skin with the efficient cruelty of a thing that had been doing this work for thousands of years. She began calculating again. How long could a person survive outside in this weather? She had read somewhere that extreme cold could kill in 4 to 6 hours. The sun would be fully down within the hour. That gave her until midnight, maybe later if she found shelter from the wind. The livery stable. At least there would be straw. The body heat of horses. She stood up, picked up her carpet bag, and almost walked directly into the man coming out of the general store. He was carrying a crate of supplies, and Lena was so lost in her own spiraling calculations that she stepped right into his path without seeing him. She stumbled. The crate shifted in his arms. Her carpet bag hit the boardwalk and burst open, spilling a cotton dress and the broken pocket watch onto the frozen dirt. She smelled him before she saw him clearly. Tanned leather, dried grass, coffee maybe. The particular scent of a man who spent his days working in open air far from other people. A hand caught her elbow, steadying her. The grip was firm and calloused, and it held her just long enough to make sure she would not fall. Then it released. Not a second longer than necessary. You all right? His voice was low and rough, not unfriendly, but unused. The voice of a man who did not talk much and had long since stopped trying to make it pretty when he did. Lena looked up. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, in a work-worn coat that had seen better years. Dark hair that needed cutting, falling across a forehead, lined by weather and something older than weather. Eyes the color of creek water in winter. That pale gray blue that looks almost silver when the light hits it from the right angle. But it was the scar that held her. A thick, jagged line running from his left ear down across his jaw to the corner of his mouth. It pulled the skin into a permanent slight twist that made it impossible to read his expression from one side. This was not a scar from a fall or a broken fence. Lena had seen enough of the world to recognize the work of a blade. She looked at it, not with fear, not with revulsion. She looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. Because Lena Mercer had scars of her own. Hers just did not show on the outside. You are the woman from the stagecoach, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He set the crate down on the boardwalk and knelt to pick up her things. His hands were large and careful. He folded the cotton dress and placed it back in the carpet bag. He picked up the broken watch. And he did something that Lena would remember for the rest of her life. He did not turn it over, did not examine it, did not ask why she carried a timepiece that no longer worked. He simply placed it back in the bag as if he understood that some broken things are kept for reasons that do not require explanation. He handed the bag back to her. "Where are you staying?" Lena hesitated. Pride and desperation fought a brief, savage war inside her chest. Desperation won the way it always did. "I am working on that. Boarding house turned you away. There was no point in lying. I do not have the money." He studied her. Not the way the boarding house woman had studied her. Not measuring and dismissing. He looked at her the way you look at something that has been damaged and you are trying to figure out what it needs. His eyes moved from her thin coat to her carpet bag to the church steps where she had been sitting, and she watched him put the pieces together without needing to be told. "Nobody sleeps outside in this weather," he said. "I am aware," Lena said, and she was surprised to hear something in her own voice that she thought had died months ago. Something dry and thin but alive. Something that in better times might have been humor. "I have got a cabin," he said, "about 8 miles out up toward the mountain. Extra blankets. Warm fire. You can stay until the stagecoach gets fixed." He said it the way you might say water is wet or the sky is blue. A fact requiring no elaboration and expecting no negotiation. "Name is Silas Blackburn." Lena stood on the boardwalk of Willow Creek with the cold biting through her coat and the dark coming on, and 17 cents to her name, and nowhere on this earth to go. Every instinct she had screamed danger. A woman did not go off alone with a strange man into empty wilderness at nightfall. That was how women disappeared from the world without leaving a trace. Everything she had learned in 22 years of surviving said no. But she watched him walk to his wagon and load the crate among the other supplies. She watched him speak softly to his horses, two sturdy bays with winter coats just coming in. He rubbed one behind the ears until it nickered and pushed its nose against his chest. She watched his hands, the way they moved, patient, deliberate, never rough, never careless. A man who was gentle with his horses was unlikely to be cruel to a stranger. That was not logic, it was instinct. But instinct had kept her alive this far, and she was not about to stop listening to it now. She picked up her carpet bag and followed him to the wagon. And as she climbed up onto the bench seat, she understood with a clarity that cut like glass that she was placing more than her life in this stranger's hands. She was placing everything, including the part of herself she had guarded most fiercely across 1,200 miles of desperate travel. She did not follow him because she trusted him. She followed him because she had run out of reasons to be afraid of dying. The wagon pulled away from town, and the last buildings of Willow Creek fell behind them, like props being struck from a stage. Ahead, the road narrowed into a trail that climbed through pine forests so thick and dark they swallowed the last of the daylight whole. The air thinned, the temperature dropped further. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on frozen ground, and the wind moving through the treetops with the patience of something that has been here longer than any human and intends to remain long after the last one is gone. Silas did not talk. The longest sentence he managed on the entire ride was "Watch the rut there," when the wagon wheel caught a washed-out groove and jerked hard to the left. Lena grabbed the bench. Their shoulders touched. He pulled away as if the contact had burned him. They were a mile from the cabin when the wolf appeared. It stood in the middle of the trail, a big gray male, alone on no pack. Just one animal with its head low and its eyes catching the lantern light in two bright points of gold. The horses saw it first. The bay on the left threw its head up and tried to shy sideways. The other locked its legs and stopped dead. Lena went rigid, every muscle in her body pulled tight as wire. Her hand gripped the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles went white. Silas held the reins steady with his left hand and reached slowly for the rifle with his right. He did not raise it. He rested his hand on the stock the way a man rests his hand on a Bible, ready but not committed, prepared but not eager. And he waited. The wolf stared at him. He stared back. 10 seconds. 20. The wind moved through the grass on both sides of the trail, and the lantern flame guttered and steadied, and the two animals, the man and the wolf, held each other in a silence so complete it felt like the whole mountain was watching. Then the wolf turned its head, slow and deliberate, and it walked off the trail into the tall grass and disappeared. One moment it was there, solid and real, The next moment, the grass and the trees had swallowed it whole, as if it had never existed at all. Silas clucked to the horses and they moved forward, blowing hard, shaking their heads. He did not say anything about what had just happened, but Lena had seen everything she needed to see. His hand had not trembled. His breathing had not changed. He had the rifle within reach and every reason in the world to pull that trigger, and he chose not to. This was a man who understood danger, who lived beside it every day, and who had made a deliberate choice about how to answer it. The question that formed in her mind and would not leave was whether that control pointed outward or inward, whether the danger he carried was the kind that protected or the kind that consumed. The cabin appeared as the last light bled out of the sky, low, built from rough-hewn pine logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch running along the front. Behind it, a line of cottonwood trees and the sound of running water from the creek that came down off the mountain. A barn, a chicken coop, a corral where two horses watched their approach with lazy interest. And behind the cabin, barely visible in the failing light, two wooden crosses standing in the frozen grass. Lena saw them, just shapes in the dusk. She did not yet know what they meant, but she felt something shift in the air between her and the man beside her. A weight that had not been there a moment before, as if the cabin itself was holding a secret and the crosses were the only part of it visible above the surface. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down and offered his hand to help her from the bench. She took it. Her fingers were ice cold and she was shaking, and he noticed both of these things and said nothing about either. He simply held her hand steady until her feet were on solid ground, and then he let go. Inside the cabin was dark and cold, smelling of old wood smoke and dust and the particular emptiness of a place lived in by a man who had stopped caring about comfort a long time ago. He lit the kerosene lamp and warm light spread across a single large room, a stone fireplace, a rough table with two chairs, a dry sink, shelves holding tin cups and plates, a bed against the far wall covered with a patchwork quilt that someone had made with care a long time ago. And that was everything. No decorations, no pictures, no curtains, no flowers. Nothing that suggested joy had ever lived here. Nothing that said this room belonged to a man who believed he deserved more than the bare minimum required to keep breathing. It was the loneliest room Lena had ever seen, and she had seen some lonely rooms. She stood in the middle of it and looked around. She could feel Silas watching her, bracing himself, waiting for the judgment, the pity, the careful neutral expression people wore when they did not want to say what they were really thinking. Lena Mercer looked at this cold, bare cabin where Silas Blackburn had been slowly disappearing for 3 years, and she said one word: warm. Something cracked inside his chest. Not a break, just a shift. The sound ice makes on a creek in early spring when the water beneath begins to move again. Small, almost nothing, but enough to let something through that had been frozen solid for a very long time. He built the fire without speaking, working with the efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times. Kindling first coaxed into flame with steady breath. Then larger logs stacked until the fire crackled, and heat began pushing the coal back toward the walls and out through the gaps in the logs where it belonged. He pulled blankets from a chest near the bed and made up a pallet on the floor near the hearth, a rolled coat for a pillow, a wool blanket on top. "Where do I sleep?" Lena asked, the question that would echo through this story from beginning to end and back again. "Right here," Silas said, pulling the blanket straight, smoothing it flat. "I will take the porch." She started to protest. He stopped her. Not unkindly, just with the quiet certainty of a man who had already made this decision and was not going to unmake it. "The fire will keep this room warm through the night. More wood by the door if it gets low. Coffee on the stove if you need it. Help yourself to whatever is here." He was at the door before she found her voice. "Mr. Blackburn." "Silas," he said, without turning. "Silas, I do not know how to thank you. No need." He went outside, closed the door softly, sat down on the porch with his back against the cabin wall, and wrapped a thin blanket around his shoulders and faced the dark, where two wooden crosses stood like sentinels in the frozen grass. The cold was immediate and savage. It cut through the blanket in his coat and his shirt and settled into his bones with the patience of something that intended to stay. He did not care. He had endured worse. The winter he buried Annabelle, he had slept on the frozen ground next to her grave for 3 nights, running before Pearl Duggins rode over and physically dragged him inside and slapped him hard enough to draw blood and said, "You can die if you want to, but you are going to do it sober, so you know exactly what you are throwing away." He whispered into the dark, his breath making small white clouds that the wind tore apart as soon as they formed. "I am not replacing you. I just could not let another one die because I did nothing." The wind answered with nothing. Annabelle had been dead for 2 years and 5 months, and she had never answered him once. He kept talking to her anyway, because the alternative was admitting that she could not hear. And he was not ready for that. From inside the cabin came a sound, small and choked and muffled by walls and blankets, and the desperate effort of a woman trying to keep her pain silent. The sound of someone who had forgotten how to cry out loud, who had been holding it in so long that when it finally came, it escaped in little broken pieces instead of one clean release. Silas closed his eyes. He knew that sound. He had made that exact sound himself in this cabin for months after Annabelle died. The sound of grief compressed into something small enough to carry, small enough to survive. He sat on the porch in the freezing dark and listened to a stranger cry. He did not go to her. He did not look away. He sat there bearing witness to a pain he recognized as intimately as his own heartbeat. Two people separated by a log wall, each carrying something too heavy to hold and too dangerous to put down, each alone with a secret that was eating them alive. And the night went on, and the cold deepened. And somewhere to the east, getting closer with every passing hour, a man named Garrett Hale sat in a small office above a feed store and slid a photograph across a desk to a private detective and said she answered my brother's advertisement. "Mail order bride. My brother died before she arrived, but she kept heading west. Track her. The trail leads toward Wyoming territory. Make it narrower." 3 days passed. 3 days in Silas Blackburn's cabin. 3 days that settled into a rhythm so natural it frightened Lena with its ease. She woke each morning to the smell of coffee because Silas was always up before her, moving quietly around the cabin in that careful way he had. As if he were trying not to disturb the air itself, he would set her coffee on the table and step back. Not hand it to her, set it down and move away, giving her space without being asked, without being told, without any indication that he understood why a woman might need space. He simply knew. The way some people know which way north is without a compass. She noticed everything about the way this man moved through the world, the way he placed things down for her to pick up rather than putting them in her hands, the way he cleared his throat softly before entering a room, the way he kept 3 feet between them at all times as if he had drawn an invisible boundary and would not cross it. For a woman who had spent years having her space invaded by a man who believed proximity was the same as ownership. For a woman who had learned to flinch at footsteps and tense at the sound of a door opening and hold her breath when a male voice rose above conversational volume. For that woman, what Silas Blackburn offered without words or ceremony or any expectation of gratitude was the most extraordinary kindness anyone had ever shown her. She discovered something about him on the second day. The cabin had ingredients: flour and sugar and salt and dried beef and potatoes in the root cellar and eggs from the chickens. Good ingredients. Enough for real meals. But Silas cooked the same thing every time. Beans, salt pork, coffee. As if variety were a pleasure he had revoked from himself. As if feeding himself anything beyond the minimum required for survival would be an act of enjoyment, and enjoyment was something he no longer believed he had the right to experience. Lena recognized this because she had been doing the same thing for 8 months, eating only enough to keep moving, sleeping only enough to function, punishing herself with deprivation because comfort felt like something reserved for people who had not done terrible things in the dark. On the third afternoon, Silas rode out to check cattle in the north pasture, and Lena opened the wooden chest near the bed. She was looking for extra blankets. The November nights were brutal. Even with the fire burning strong, the cold crept through the log walls and settled on the floor where she slept and wrapped around her body like a second skin made entirely of ice. She found the baby shoes first. 2 pairs, tiny, unworn, 1 pair knitted from soft yellow yarn, each stitch even and careful, made by hands that took their time, that believed they had all the time in the world. The other pair cut from leather so supple it could be folded into a palm. stitched with threads so fine it was nearly invisible. They had never been put on a child's feet. They had been made with love and hope and the kind of careful dreaming that only happens when you believe the future is going to be kind. And then they had been placed in a dark chest because the child they were meant for never arrived. Or arrived and did not stay. Lena held them in her hands, and her heart stopped. Not because she was surprised, because she understood. She understood the way only someone who has lost something irreplaceable can understand the depth of another person's loss. These shoes told the whole story without a single word spoken. Someone had imagined tiny feet. Someone had prepared with patient hands and a heart swelling with dreams. And then the dream ended, and the shoes went into the dark. She placed them back carefully, exactly as she had found them. Then she saw the letter, folded beneath the shoes, a woman's handwriting, small and neat and precise. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear. Lena unfolded it just enough to read the first line. Dear Catherine, I am frightened of him. Her blood went cold. The cabin, which had begun over 3 days to feel like the safest place she had known since childhood, suddenly felt like a cage with the door swinging shut. Her hands began to shake. She did not read further. She folded the letter back precisely as it had been, placed it beneath the baby shoes, closed the chest. I am frightened of him. Written by a woman who had lived in this cabin, about the man whose roof Lena was sleeping under. Annabelle, the dead wife. The woman buried behind the cabin in one of those 2 graves Lena had not yet been close enough to read. Annabelle had been frightened of Silas Blackburn, frightened enough to write a letter about it, to someone named Catherine. Lena stood in the middle of the cabin and forced herself to breathe. She looked at the door, and the old instinct rose in her like water rising in a well. The instinct that said run. The same instinct that had gotten her out of Pennsylvania, out of a window, down a dark road, onto a stagecoach heading anywhere that was not there. The instinct that said when things get dangerous, the only smart move is to leave before the danger finds you asleep. But she had nowhere to go. 17 cents would not carry her to the next town. And beyond the practical calculation, there was something else. Something she could not reconcile with the words in that letter. The way Silas moved through the world. The way he slept on a freezing porch so she could feel safe. The way he set her coffee down instead of handing it to her. The way he had not pulled the trigger on the wolf. The way his hands moved over the horses with a gentleness that seemed practiced and deliberate. As if gentleness were a skill he had worked hard to learn. A discipline he maintained the way a man rehabilitates a broken bone. Daily, carefully. With the knowledge that the break happened and cannot unhappen, but the limb can still learn to bear weight again. A man who was truly dangerous would not freeze on a porch for a stranger. Would he? She pushed the question down with all the others, the growing collection of things she could not afford to examine. And she went back to the bread dough she had been working before curiosity led her to the chest. But the seed was planted. And it grew in the dark the way seeds do, changing the soil around it, changing everything. That evening, Lena made the stew. Dried beef from the stores and potatoes from the root cellar and onions and the last of the carrots she found wrapped in burlap on the bottom shelf. She simmered it for hours until the meat fell apart at the touch of a spoon, and the broth was thick and rich, and the cabin smelled like a home for what she guessed was the first time in a very long while. Silas came in from the cold, stamping his boots on the porch, hanging his coat by the door. He sat at the table. She set the bowl in front of him. He picked up his spoon, took the first bite, and stopped. His eyes closed. Not like a man savoring food, like a man absorbing a wound, as if the taste of something cooked with care after years of deliberately denying himself any kindness was not pleasure but pain, as if tenderness after that much deprivation hit harder than cruelty ever could. He ate slowly. When the bowl was empty, he sat there with his hands flat on the table, not looking at her. That was real good. Thank you. 2 words of gratitude spoken as if they cost him something. As if thank you were a muscle he had not used in years, and the effort of flexing it left him winded. They talked that evening, carefully, still keeping distance between the words the way they kept distance between their bodies. But the silences grew shorter, and the sentences grew longer. And Lena found herself almost smiling once or twice at the dry way he described his more difficult cattle. Then she was at the dry sink washing dishes, and the knife slipped. A small cut on her index finger. Nothing. The blade nicked the skin just below the nail, and a thin line of blood welled up and dropped into the basin of water. One drop. Two. Lena froze. Not from pain, from the color. Red in water, spreading, thinning. The way blood looks when it moves through clean liquid. Becoming something almost beautiful before becoming something horrible. She was back on the staircase, standing at the top, Henry at the bottom, blood on the wooden floor, not moving. The silence of that house closing around her like a fist. She could not breathe. She could not move. She was in Pennsylvania at midnight, and the world had collapsed into a single image that she could not escape no matter how many miles she put between herself and that house. Silas appeared beside her. She had not heard him move. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not demand an explanation or reach for her or crowd her space. He took a clean cloth from the counter, and he paused. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, asking permission with his eyes the way a man does when he has learned through experience or through loss or through the slow, painful education of his own failures that touch can be violence for someone who has been touched wrong. She gave the smallest nod. He lifted her hand from the water, wrapped the cut finger in the cloth, and held her hand in both of his. Warm, steady, scarred and calloused hands closed around her smaller ones like something fragile and precious and worth being careful with. He stood there in silence while Lena shook. While the staircase receded and the present came back in pieces. The cabin, the fire, the smell of stew. Wyoming, alive. Here. He let go, stepped back, gave her space. And Lena said something she had not planned to say. Something she had not told anyone on this earth. Not the landlady in St. Louis. Not the stagecoach driver. Not a single living soul in 8 months of running. I hurt someone once. I do not know if they are alive or dead. 3 sentences, exposed and trembling and raw, hanging in the air of that cabin like smoke that cannot find its way out. Silas stood there, and he looked at Lena Mercer with an expression she had not braced herself for. Not pity, not shock, not the hollow sympathy that people offer when they do not know what else to give. Recognition, as if he were hearing his own story told back to him in someone else's voice. As if the words she had just spoken were a key that fit a lock he had been carrying for years without knowing what had opened. He did not ask what happened. She did not explain. But something shifted between them in that moment. Some wall that had been standing solid and necessary between 2 strangers developed a crack. Not a collapse, just a fissure. Just wide enough to let a thin line of light through. And in the chest across the room, beneath 2 pairs of unworn baby shoes, a dead woman's letter waited like a fuse already burning towards something neither of them could see. Outside the cabin, the November wind picked up and carried the first deep cold of winter down from the high peaks. The horses shifted in the corral. The creek ran black and fast beneath a skin of ice that thickened with every passing hour. And somewhere far to the east, the detective hired by Garrett Hale folded a map and circled a name. Willow Creek, Wyoming territory. The trail was getting narrower. The next morning, Lena went behind the cabin looking for the well and found 2 graves instead. She stood in the early frost with her breath making small white clouds in the still air and read the names carved into weathered wood. The tall cross said Annabelle Blackburn, born 1842, died 1871. The light of my life. The small cross said Baby Blackburn, 1871. Never drew breath. Lena stood between the 2 graves and understood that the man who had given her shelter was living inside his own graveyard. That every morning he woke in that cabin and walked out onto that porch, and the first thing he saw was the place where he had buried his wife and the child who never opened its eyes. That he had chosen to stay here, to build his solitary life within sight of everything he had lost. Not because he was punishing himself, or maybe exactly because he was punishing himself. She did not yet know which. She did not go inside to ask about it. She did not demand a history or an account or an explanation. Instead, she knelt down in the frozen grass and began pulling weeds from around the crosses. The earth was hard and cold, and the weeds came up reluctantly, clinging to the soil with the stubborn grip of things that grow where they are not wanted. Lena pulled them one by one. working slowly and carefully around the wooden markers the way you work around something sacred. When Silas found her 30 minutes later, she was on her knees beside his dead wife's grave, with her fingers raw and dirty, and a small pile of uprooted weeds beside her. She did not look up when she heard his boots in the grass. She just kept working. He stood there for a long time. She could feel him watching her the way you feel sun on your back even when you cannot see it. The weight of his attention, the surprise in it, the confusion. Then he sat down, not beside her, a few feet away, cross-legged in the frozen grass with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the two crosses that held everything he had loved and lost in this world. He was quiet so long that Lena finished the weeds around Annabelle's grave and started on the babies. She died in childbirth, Silas said. His voice was flat, not empty, the opposite, so full of feeling that he had compressed it down to something dense and hard and controlled, the way you compress gunpowder into a cartridge. Every word measured, every syllable held in check, because releasing even one would release them all. We had been out here 2 years, built this cabin together, every lay, every nail. She was the strongest person I ever knew. When the baby started coming, she was not scared. She said women had been doing this since the beginning of time, and she was not going to be the one who could not manage it. He picked up a piece of dried grass and turned it in his fingers. The labor went wrong. I am not a doctor. I did not know what to do. There was blood, too much of it. The baby came and was not breathing. I held that baby in my arms for 2 hours before I could make myself believe it was real, that she was gone, both of them gone. He said it the way a soldier gives a report from a battlefield he barely survived. Facts stripped of everything but sequence, because that was the only way he could say it without shattering. I dug the graves the next morning. Ground was frozen. Took me all day with a pickaxe. Pearl Duggins came and tried to help, but I would not let her. Had to do it myself. Felt like if I did not dig those graves with my own hands, then it was not real. Lena stopped pulling weeds. She sat back on her heels and looked at Silas Blackburn, this man made of scars and silence. And she saw the thing he had been hiding behind, all that quiet. Not strength, not stoicism, grief. A grief so enormous it had consumed everything else and left only the shell. A man hollowed out by loss and still standing only because his body had not yet received the message that the man inside had already stopped. I know, she said. And then she told him. She told him about Pennsylvania, about the staircase and the blood and the midnight darkness and the man she might have killed. She told him about Henry's hand in her hair and the shove that was not a decision but a reflex, about 8 months of carrying this secret like a stone in her chest, because there was no one alive she trusted enough to set it down. They sat on cold grass beside 2 graves and shared the same hell in different versions. 2 people who had each done something they could not undo, who had each spent months alone with a weight they could not put down, and who discovered in the most unlikely place on earth that the only thing heavier than carrying a secret alone is the moment when you finally hand it to someone else and they do not drop it. I think that is why I was not afraid when I followed you that night, Lena said. Not because I trusted you, because I had stopped being afraid of dying. Something shifted behind Silas's eyes. Something buried deep, moving loose for the first time in years, like a stone in a riverbed when the current finally runs strong enough to move what has been still for so long that the river had forgotten it was there. He looked at Lena, and she saw the exact moment when his reason for caring changed. It was no longer guilt, no longer obligation, no longer the simple transaction of a man with a spare roof offering it to someone who needed one. It was something else, something he did not have a word for, something that frightened him more than anything that had frightened him since Shiloh. They rode into Willow Creek on the 4th morning to check on the stagecoach, and Lena felt the town watching before she saw the eyes. It was a particular sensation, one she had learned in Pennsylvania. The feeling of being measured by people who have already decided what you are worth before you open your mouth. The main street was not crowded, but every face that turned toward the wagon carried the same expression. Curiosity sharpened to a point. A scarred mountain man who had not brought anyone to town in 3 years was suddenly riding in with a young woman on the bench seat beside him, and the town was doing its arithmetic. The blacksmith delivered the news without ceremony and without hope. Axle parts from Denver, 10 days minimum. Could be longer depending on weather and the freight schedule. Lena heard the words and waited for the panic, the desperation, the fear. 10 more days stranded in a town where she knew one person and that person was a man. The whole community treated like something dangerous that had wandered down from the mountain and might wander back up if left alone long enough. But the panic did not come. Instead, she felt something she could not name. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at her. And they both understood that 10 more days was not a sentence. It was something else. Something neither of them was ready to say out loud. At the general store buying flour and coffee and a new spool of thread because Lena had noticed that half of Silas's shirts needed mending, she felt the eyes before she saw the woman. A prickling on the back of her neck. The sense of being watched by something patient and deliberate. The kind of attention that does not announce itself but makes the air in the room heavier. She turned and saw Cordelia Ashford for the first time. The mayor's wife stood near the dry goods counter in a dress that cost more than everything Lena owned put together and then doubled. 53 years old. Gray hair arranged with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was not vanity, but artillery. A face that might have been kind once but had been shaped by pressure and lost into something harder. The way raw iron is hammered into a blade. Her eyes traveled from Lena to Silas and back, and she smiled. Not warmth, not welcome. The smile of a woman who had just identified something in her field of vision that did not belong there and was already calculating the most efficient method of removal. Lena felt danger, not the kind that comes with noise and speed, the kind that moves slowly and quietly and is already behind you before you realize it was ever in front of you. She felt it the way animals feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm, in the blood and the bone. In the ancient part of the brain that does not need evidence because it has been keeping things alive for 1,000,000 years on nothing but instinct. They did not speak. Cordelia simply looked and smiled and turned back to her shopping as if Lena were no more significant than a fly on the windowsill. On the ride home, Silas was quiet longer than usual. The wagon creaked and the horses plodded and the mountain trail wound upward through the pines. Then he said something that changed the weight of the air between them. "Mrs. Ashford noticed you." "I know," Lena said. "No, you do not understand." He pulled the reins tighter and the horses slowed. In Willow Creek, Cordelia, Ashford does not just notice people. She chooses them. And when she chooses someone, that person does not get peace again. He told her then about Cordelia, about the son she had lost years ago, a late miscarriage that nearly killed her. How something in Cordelia broke after that and healed wrong the way a bone heals crooked when it is not set properly. How the grief and the helplessness is calcified into something that looked like strength but was really control. Absolute unrelenting control over everything within her reach. Because if she could keep the world ordered and predictable and exactly the way she believed it should be, then nothing could be taken from her again. She did not see her cruelty as cruelty. She saw it as protection. And that was what made her more dangerous than any man with a gun. A person who believes they are doing right will go further than a person who knows they are doing wrong. The information changed how Lena understood the woman she had seen in the general store. Cordelia Ashford was not simply powerful. She was wounded. And wounded people who find power instead of healing become the most dangerous force in any community. Because their pain gives them permission. Because their loss gives them justification. Because they can look at the wreckage they leave behind and say, "I am protecting what matters," and believe it absolutely. Pearl Duggins arrived the next morning with the timing of a woman who had a sixth sense for trouble finding its way to Silas Blackburn's door. She rode in on a buckskin mare with a shotgun across her saddle and a pot of stew hanging from the saddle horn, because Pearl Duggins never arrived anywhere empty-handed and never arrived anywhere unarmed. She was 55 years old, built like a fence post, wrapped in rawhide. Dark skin weathered by decades of sun and wind, and the particular kind of endurance that comes from surviving things that were designed to destroy you. Born into slavery in Georgia, freed by the war, come west with her husband Samuel in 1866 to build something from nothing in a country that did not want them to have anything at all. Samuel died of fever in 1870, and Pearl had kept the ranch running alone ever since through drought and blizzard in the steady grinding hostility of a world that looked at her skin and decided what she was worth before she spoke a single word. She was the one who had stitched Silas's face when he first arrived in Wyoming territory. The scar was not from a horse accident, which was what people in town assumed. It was a bayonet wound from the Battle of Shiloh, April 1862. A blade drawn across his face in close combat so fast he heard it before he felt it. The field surgeon who started stitching was killed by artillery before he finished. Pearl had recognized a war wound the moment she saw it, and she had sewn him up without asking questions, because out here questions were a luxury that could get people killed. She looked at Lena with sharp, appraising eyes and said, "So this is the girl the whole town is buzzing about. I thought you would be taller the way they tell it." Lena liked her immediately. While Silas rode out, Pearl took Lena somewhere. They saddled 2 horses and rode east for about a mile until they came to a place where the mountain flattened into a small meadow. Weeds grew through a cracked stone foundation. A rusted stovepipe lay on its side in the grass. A chimney stood alone, connected to nothing like a finger pointing at a sky that had no answers. Family named Sullivan ran a homestead here, Pearl said, sat her horse and looked at the ruins with an expression that was older than sadness and colder than anger. Came from County Cork in Ireland. Husband, wife, 2 little children. The baby was born right there where that stovepipe is lying. She paused and let the wind fill the silence. Cordelia Ashford decided they lowered the tone of the area. 6 months later, their barn burned. Then their well was poisoned. Then the sheriff suggested it might be healthier to move along. They left for California with nothing but the clothes they were wearing and 2 children too young to understand why they had to leave their home. Pearl's eyes were steady and hard and full of the kind of anger that has gone past hot and cooled into something permanent. Something that does not burn out because it is no longer fire. It is stone. There was a freedman before them. Bought land near town, wanted to farm. Cordelia told her husband property values would suffer. The man's cattle were poisoned, his fences cut, his well filled with dead animals, gone inside a month, and a widow who sold whiskey out of her house, and another family who ran a laundry on Main Street. All gone, all driven out, all by the quiet machinery of Cordelia Ashford. "I survived because I live far enough that she does not bother," Pearl said. "But you are right there in her sight line, living with a man she considers dangerous and strange, defying every rule she has built her world around. You are not the first person she has aimed at, just the latest." Lena looked at the ruined foundation, the stovepipe, the chimney standing alone. She thought about the people who built something here and lost it. Not to weather or disease or the ordinary cruelty of the land, but to the cruelty of a woman who could not tolerate anything that challenged her idea of how the world should be ordered. "I have been running for 8 months, Lena said, and she was surprised by the steel in her own voice, by the way the words came out not as a confession, but as a declaration. "I am done," Good Pearl said. "Then you need to be ready for what comes next." What came next arrived the following afternoon in a polished buggy driven by a hired man. Cordelia Ashford came to the cabin while Lena was alone. She carried a basket of bread and preserves, the universal currency of women who wanted to appear neighborly while conducting reconnaissance behind a smile. Lena heard the buggy and came to the porch with her hand instinctively near the doorframe. Near the inside of the cabin where the rifle leaned against the wall, Cordelia climbed down with practiced grace, held up the basket, smiled that same calculated smile that showed teeth but never reached the eyes. "I wanted to welcome our newest neighbor. Such a long ride up this mountain. You must be very devoted to Mr. Blackburn's company to endure it." The emphasis on devoted was subtle but unmistakable. A needle slid under the skin, designed to cause exactly the right amount of pain. "That is very kind," Lena said. She did not take the basket. Cordelia's eyes moved past Lena into the cabin, scanning, evaluating, taking inventory of every visible object the way a general surveys terrain before committing troops. Such a pretty young thing, living all the way up here with Mr. Blackburn. People do talk. A young woman and a man with, she gestured vaguely toward her own face, his history. The graves behind the house, 2 of them. People notice these things. A man whose wife died under his roof and whose baby never drew breath. And now another young woman under that same roof. She paused and let silence do the work that words had started. "You are not frightened," Lena looked at Cordelia Ashford with the unblinking focus of someone who had spent years reading the intentions hidden behind polite sentences, who had learned in a house in Pennsylvania that the most dangerous words were the ones that sounded kindest. I am frightened of many things, Mrs. Ashford. Mr. Blackburn is not on the list. Something flickered behind Cordelia's eyes, not anger. Surprise, the surprise of a woman who had spent decades intimidating people with courtesy and had just encountered someone the courtesy did not work on. And beneath the surprise, just for a moment, something else. Recognition. As if she saw in Lena something she remembered from a long time ago. Something she had been before loss reshaped her into what she was now. Then the mask came back, smooth and seamless. How brave, Cordelia said, or how foolish. In this country, the two often look the same. She turned, climbed back into the buggy, rode away down the mountain trail without looking back. The basket of bread sat on the porch railing like a calling card from an enemy who wanted you to know she had been close enough to touch your door. Lena did not touch it. She stood on the porch and watched the buggy disappear, and she understood with complete clarity that what had just happened was not a welcome. It was a declaration of war. 3 days later, Silas found 3 dead cattle in the north pasture. Their throats were cut clean and professional. Not wolves, not bears. A blade wielded by someone who knew exactly where to place it for maximum efficiency and minimum noise. 3 cows lying in the frozen grass with their blood turning the frost pink around them. $90, Silas said when he returned to the cabin, his face still and hard as a frozen lake. A third of what I would make this year. Someone wants me off this land, or wants me too poor to stay. Lena did not wait for him to decide what to do. She saddled a horse the next morning and rode the 8 miles into Willow Creek alone. She found Cordelia at the general store examining bolts of fabric with the unhurried attention of a woman who owned enough time to waste it on choosing between 2 shades of blue. Mrs. Ashford, 3 of our cattle were killed last night. Throats cut. Professional work. Do you know anything about it? Cordelia turned slowly, held a length of blue cotton against her wrist as if checking the color. Her expression was perfect sympathy, perfect concern, a performance so polished it could have been hung in a frame. Oh, how terrible. The wilderness can be so dangerous, especially for people who are not accustomed to it, especially for people who perhaps do not belong in it. I belong wherever I choose to stand, Mrs. Ashford. Cordelia's eyes narrowed. The width of a knife blade, the first honest expression Lena had seen on her face. What a spirited young woman you are. I do hope that spirit serves you well. She turned back to her fabric. Conversation over. Lena walked out with her pulse hammering and her hands steady, and the absolute certainty that she had just drawn a line in the dirt that one of them would die on. That night, something broke inside Silas Blackburn. He did not let Lena see it happen. He waited until her breathing went slow and deep with sleep. Then he went to the barn. The whiskey bottle had been sitting on a shelf behind the horse tack for 2 years, gathering dust. Untouched since the night Pearl had found him half dead and slapped him back to life with words he never forgot. 2 years. He had left that bottle alone for 2 years. 700 mornings of choosing to walk past it. 700 mornings of proving to the ghost of Annabelle Blackburn that her husband could be better than the man she had reason to fear. But now 3 cows were dead in his pasture, and someone was trying to destroy him, and the old thing was stirring in his chest. The thing Shiloh had planted in him 12 years ago and 3 years of grief had watered. The rage, the need to break something with his hands, the violence that lived in his bones like a fever waiting for the moment his defenses dropped low enough. He uncorked the bottle, drank. The whiskey burned going down and hit his stomach like a fist, and he drank again. Then he stood up and put his fist through the barn wall. The pain was immediate and clarifying. The skin over his knuckles split, and blood ran down his fingers, and he stared at his hand in the lantern light and thought, there you are. There is the man Annabelle was afraid of. The man who came home from the war with something broken inside that could not be fixed by time or distance or love or the birth and death of everything he cared about. The barn door creaked open. Lena stood in the doorway, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide with something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same house. She did not run, but she stayed in the doorway. She did not come closer. Are you going to tell me what that letter meant? Silas felt the blood drain from his face. You read it, only the first line. I am frightened of him. That was all I needed. The wind pushed against the barn walls. The horses shifted in their stalls. Blood dripped from his knuckles into the straw. Silas sat down, right there on the barn floor, back against the wall, and he told her the truth. Shiloh. The word landed in the space between them like a stone dropped from a height that should have killed it. April 1862. 2 days of fighting so close you could smell the fear on the man trying to kill you. The bayonet that opened his face from ear to jaw in a single stroke, fast as a snake, and the sound it made going through skin and muscle, a sound he could still hear on quiet nights if he did not keep the wind loud enough to drown it. The field hospital where they stitched him without anything for the pain because there was nothing left and the surgeon needed the table for the next man. And the next after that, until the tables ran out and they laid men on the ground in rows, and the screaming did not stop for 3 days. Coming home. The nightmares, not gradual, all at once, like a dam that holds and holds and holds and then does not. The dreams came first, then the anger, then the need to destroy things with his hands because the destruction was the only thing that quieted the screaming inside his skull. I smashed chairs, punched walls, threw a table through a window. Annabelle would find me standing in the yard in the middle of the night screaming at things only I could see. He looked at the blood on his hand, dark in the lantern light, almost black. She was right to be afraid. I never touched her. Not once, I swear on everything I have left. But she lived with a man she could not predict. She never knew which man was going to sit across from her at breakfast, the one she married or the one who came home from Shiloh. And that uncertainty, that constant waiting for it to get worse, that is its own kind of violence. It does not leave bruises, but it eats a person alive, just the same. He looked up at Lena standing in the doorway with the wind at her back and the dark behind her. She wrote that letter to her sister Catherine. Never sent it. I found it after she died, read it once. Should have burned it. Could not. Felt like burning it would be pretending it never happened. And it happened. Silence in the barn. The lantern flame guttered and held. I spent 5 years after the war becoming the man she deserved. I quit the whiskey. I learned to breathe through the nightmares. I taught myself to be still when the rage came, to hold it, to let it pass through without acting on it. 5 years of becoming someone better. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. Just enough. But by the time I made it, she was in the ground. Lena stood in that doorway and processed. Every instinct she had, the instinct that carried her out of Pennsylvania and across 1,200 miles, screamed at her to leave. This man was dangerous once. His dead wife said so in her own hand. This was the moment to run. But she looked at his hand. The knuckles split from hitting a wall instead of a person. The whiskey bottle on its side in the straw with most of the liquid still inside because he had stopped himself before it was empty. The truth in his eyes offered freely and completely when a lie would have been so much easier and so much safer. She saw a man who had been broken by war and had spent years rebuilding himself piece by piece, who had arrived too late to save the woman he loved from the fear he had caused, who carried that failure like a wound that would never close, and who was sitting on a barn floor bleeding and confessing because a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks had asked him a direct question, and he respected her too much to answer it with anything less than the whole truth. I am not going to live with a man who destroys himself, Lena said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something that had been forged in fire and would not bend. If you want me here, you choose to live, not just exist, not just endure. Choose it. Silas looked up at her, and for the first time since she arrived, she saw him afraid, not of enemies or wolves or losing cattle, afraid of being seen all the way down to the ugliest part and still being asked to stay. I will choose it, he said. I will try. Lena nodded once. Then she went back to the cabin and lay awake until she heard him come in from the barn and settle on the porch. In the dark hours before dawn, she got up and found the whiskey bottle where he had left it and walked down to the creek behind the cabin and poured it out. The liquor disappeared into the black water without a sound. She did not tell him. He did not ask. But the next morning when he went to the barn and the bottle was gone, he looked at her across the breakfast table and something passed between them that was beyond language. An agreement, a contract written in silence and sealed with coffee drunk in the early light, while the fire crackled and the wind moved through the grass outside, and two people who had been drowning separately decided to try breathing together. The rider appeared on the trail at 6 in the morning 5 days after Lena arrived, coming in hard from the east. On a mountain trail, nobody came calling at that hour with good news. Silas was on the porch with his coffee, watching the light come up through the pines when he saw the figure. A man on horseback moving fast, riding the switchbacks with the confidence of someone on a good horse who expected the world to get out of his way. Lena was still asleep. He let her sleep. Whatever was coming, she would know soon enough. The man dismounted in the yard, 36 years old, tall and well-built with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that might have been handsome if it were not arranged into an expression of barely controlled fury mixed with something that looked almost like grief. The kind of face that made you look twice because the emotions fighting for control of it were so contradictory that you could not tell which one was winning. He tied his horse to the porch rail and looked past Silas toward the cabin with eyes that held equal measures of anger and desperation in something that resembled love, if love could curdle. Lena appeared in the doorway wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She saw the visitor, and she made a sound that was half gasp and half something more complicated than surprise. Something that had recognition and dread woven together so tightly they were indistinguishable. "Garrett," she said. Garrett Hale looked at Lena Mercer standing in the doorway of a mountain cabin, wearing yesterday's dress with smoke and coffee clinging to her hair, and his face cycled through emotions so fast they blurred. Relief, anger, possessiveness, pain. "Lena, thank God. I've been looking for you for weeks." Lena stepped out from behind Silas, and Silas noticed she positioned herself beside him. Not behind, standing her own ground. "What are you doing here, Garrett?" Garrett's eyes moved from Lena to Silas, lingered on the cabin, on the two coffee cups visible through the doorway, on the proximity of these two people standing together in the early morning light in a way that said more than either of them intended. "Your landlady in St. Louis said you headed west. Trail went cold. I hired a detective, tracked you to the stagecoach line, then to Willow Creek, then here." He said the word "here" the way a man says something foul he has stepped in. "What I found is my brother's intended wife living with a strange man in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. What exactly am I supposed to think about that?" "You are not supposed to think anything," Lena said. Her voice was careful and controlled, each word placed with precision. "Mr. Blackburn offered me shelter when I had nowhere to go. That is all." Garrett ignored this. He turned to Silas. "Can we talk inside?" "No," Silas said. "We can talk right here." Garrett's jaw tightened, but then something shifted. The anger drained like water through a crack. What replaced it looked remarkably like genuine pain. "Lena, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me." She waited. "Thomas took that mining job because of me. I recommended it. I told him the money was good and the work was safe, and he would be a fool to pass it up." His eyes were bright with moisture. His voice cracked along its edges like old leather splitting under strain. "He died in that mine because I pushed him into it, and I have lived with that every single day since. I came out here because I owe him. You were going to be his wife, his family, and I promised myself I would make sure you were taken care of. That is all, just to know you are safe." Lena stood still. Silas could see the war on her face. The part that wanted to believe fighting against the part that had learned through years of hard experience that sincerity was the easiest thing in the world to perform. Then Garrett said the thing that changed everything. "Lena, there is something else. About your cousin Martha in Silver Creek." He paused. She passed. "Consumption. About 18 months ago. There is nobody there. There is nothing waiting for you in Silver Creek." The words hit Lena like a physical blow. Silas saw her sway, saw the color leave her face in a single wave, saw the moment when the last thread of her plan, the thing she had clung to across 1,200 miles, the 3-year-old letter from a cousin who promised there would always be a place for family, snapped clean. Martha was dead. Silver Creek was a dead end. The map she had been following since Pennsylvania now led to an empty room in a town with no one in it who knew her name. Lena turned without a word and walked off the porch, out into the yard, toward the open meadow beyond the corral. Not running, walking, the steady, deliberate walk of someone trying to outpace something that cannot be outpaced because it lives inside you. Silas started after her. Garrett moved to block him. Let her go. She needs time. She does not need time, Silas said. She needs to not be alone. He stepped around Garrett and followed Lena into the grass. He caught up to her about 50 yards from the cabin and fell into step beside her. Not touching, not speaking, just walking beside her in the wind while the mountain grass bent around them and the sky stretched enormous and empty above the peaks. They walked for a while. Then Lena stopped. I have nowhere to go, she said. Her voice was small and flat and stripped of everything that made it recognizable as the voice of a woman who had been finding her steel for 11 days. It was the voice of a person who has reached the bottom and discovered there is still further to fall. Silas stood beside her. The wind pushed at them both. The grass moved in patterns that looked random but were not. You have here, he said, 2 words, but they landed between them with the weight of something permanent, something that could not be unsaid. Something that was not an offer of shelter or practicality or charity, but a statement about where a person belonged. And belonging for 2 people who had spent years believing they did not deserve it was the most terrifying gift either of them had ever been given. Back at the cabin, Garrett watched through the window, the woman he had followed across half the country standing in the mountain grass with a scarred stranger, and the way she turned toward him instead of away. Garrett saw the moment he began losing. And it was not Lena he was losing to. It was Silas Blackburn, a man who had done nothing more extraordinary than stand beside her in the wind and say 2 words. Garrett left that afternoon, polite, controlled, the mask of grief and good intentions back in place. But as he mounted his horse, he leaned down and spoke to Silas in a voice too low for Lena to hear. She is my family, Blackburn. Blood. You are just a stranger who gave her a floor to sleep on. Do not confuse kindness with a claim. Silas said nothing. His jaw was tight as iron, and his eyes tracked Garrett Hale down the mountain trail until horse and rider disappeared around the bend and the trees closed behind them like a door. And on the road back to Willow Creek, Garrett Hale stopped his horse at the crest of the last rise. He sat there looking back toward the mountain. Then he turned his horse toward the largest house on Main Street, the mayor's house, Cordelia Ashford's house. He needed an ally. Someone who knew how to make people disappear from this valley without getting her own hands dirty. Guilt is a strange poison. It does not kill quickly. It works slowly, turning love into obsession, turning grief into control, turning a brother's death into a reason to destroy the happiness of the woman his brother wanted to protect. That evening, Silas and Lena sat on the porch. She mended one of his shirts. He sharpened his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filled the space between them, the way conversation fills it for other people. The sun set. The sky turned from blue to gold to amber to purple to the deep, endless black of a mountain night, where the stars come out so thick and bright they look close enough to touch. The wind settled. Somewhere in the grass, a cricket started singing, and then another until the meadow hummed with persistent life. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of the scrape of stone and the pull of thread and the settling of 2 people into each other's presence. This was the moment that said everything the story needed to say about love without using the word. 2 people sitting side by side doing small, quiet things in fading light. Not because they had to, because there was nowhere else either of them wanted to be. Silas proposed the next afternoon while Lena was feeding the chickens. He said it flat and practical. If we are legally married, you are protected by territorial law. My land becomes your land. If something happens to me, Garrett Hale cannot touch you. Lena set the grain bucket down, turned to face him, looked at his bruised hands and his weathered face and the scar that ran like a map across his jaw. That is not a reason to get married, she said. It is a good reason. The real reason, Silas. No. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are about to ask for the hardest thing they have to give. I am a woman who has never been kissed, never been held by a man who wanted me and not just what I could give him. When I marry, it will not be for property law. It will be because the man in front of me loves me and is brave enough to say it out loud. The wind blew. The chickens clucked and pecked around their feet. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in slow, patient spirals. She had forced him into a corner. She was asking for the one thing harder for Silas Blackburn than fighting or endurance or pain. She was asking him to be vulnerable, to open his chest and show her what lived inside, knowing it was not pretty and might make her leave. The silence stretched. Lena began to wonder if she had pushed too far. "It is not about the law," Silas said. His voice was rough and halting, like a man trying to speak a language he learned as a child and has not used in years, and is surprised to find the words still there buried under everything that came after. "It is about the fact that you are the first reason I have had to wake up in the morning in 3 years. And I am terrified that if I say it out loud, I will lose you the way I lost her." Lena felt her eyes burn. "Say it anyway." Another silence. The hawk circled. A jay called from the tree line and was answered by another. "I love you, Lena, and it scares me half to death." "Good," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now ask me again." He looked at her with those creek water eyes, standing in the yard with scarred hands and nothing to offer but hard land and a harder heart and the stubborn willingness to try. "Will you marry me not for the law?" "For real," Yelena said, "because I choose you, Silas Blackburn. I choose you." They married the next Sunday morning in a church half filled with people who came out of curiosity and half empty of people who stayed away out of fear. Reverend Whitfield presiding, Pearl Duggan standing as witness in her best coat with her shotgun leaning against the pew, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson from the general store looking pleased and slightly nervous. When the Reverend asked, "Do you take this woman?" Silas said yes before the question was finished. Lena laughed, a real laugh, the first one in nearly a year. The sound surprised them both. It rang through the church like a bell, and Silas looked at her with an expression of wonder as if he had forgotten laughter existed. They walked out of the church into the afternoon light, husband and wife, 3 steps, and the sheriff was waiting. "Silas, I have a warrant here for your arrest. Cattle rustling, 6 head of Circle H, branded cattle found on your property this morning." Behind the sheriff, the faces assembled like a jury that had already voted. Garrett Hale, Mayor Ashford, the ranchers, and Emmett Slade, the drifter with the $50 conscience who would not meet anyone's eyes. Silas looked at Lena. "Do not cry in front of them. Do not let them see you scared." She swallowed everything. Watch them cuff his wrists over the bandages. Watch them lead him away. But the fire came first. 2 nights before the wedding at 3 in the morning, the barn caught fire. Lena woke to the smell before the sound. Smoke thick and acrid seeping through the cabin walls. Then the roar. Not the gentle crackle of the hearth. A deeper sound. Something enormous consuming solid wood. The barn was fully engulfed by the time she reached the door. Flames climbing the walls and pouring from the loft and lighting the sky orange. The horses were screaming inside. He was at the barn doors wrestling with the latch when the heat warped the metal and it seized. He grabbed the burning door with his bare hands and wrenched it from its hinges. The horses burst out wild-eyed and singed and bolted for the corral. Silas came out stumbling, his hands held in front of him like they belonged to someone else. The skin from his wrists to his fingertips was raw and blistered and weeping. The barn collapsed behind him. Sparks exploded upward in a column that lit the mountain for half a mile. The smell of kerosene was unmistakable. This was not lightning, not accident. Someone had soaked the walls in fuel and lit them while 2 people slept 40 yards away. Lena got him inside. Heated water. Tore a clean shirt into strips. Cleaned and wrapped his burns with hands that shook while her voice held steady. "You are not allowed to die," she said. "Was not planning on it. Promise me." He looked at her, eyes dark with pain and fury and tenderness, forced through a filter of agony. "I promise." She tied the last bandage and her fingers lingered on his wrists a moment longer than necessary. They both felt it. Neither pulled away. Sunday morning, Lena walked into the church during services. Every pew occupied, every head bowed. She walked up the center aisle with dirt on her face and smoke on her clothes, and the fury of a woman who had been pushed past the last limit she thought she had. The congregation stared. Reverend Whitfield stopped speaking. Cordelia Ashford sat in the second row in black silk with a pearl brooch at her throat. "Someone burned our barn 2 nights ago," Lena said. Her voice carried to every corner. "I have no proof who did it, But I want every person in this church to know that if my husband or I come to harm the name Garrett Hale, and anyone who aided him will be the first the law hears." She called Silas my husband. They had been married less than a day. No one corrected her. The word hung in the air like a line drawn in sand. She walked out without waiting for a response. Behind her, the town was splitting. She could feel it happening in real time. Some people shifting toward her side, not from love, but from the oldest calculation there is. The recognition that what was happening to Lena and Silas could happen to any of them. Others sat frozen, eyes forward, unwilling to look up. These were the ones who feared Cordelia Ashford more than they feared their own silence. Lena stood on the church steps in her wedding dress that smelled of smoke, her husband behind bars, the barn a pile of ash on the mountainside. The only weapon she had was the one she had carried since Pennsylvania. The will to keep standing when everything said she should fall. 3 days until the trial. If she could not find a way to expose the conspiracy that put those cattle on Silas's land, the man she had married would hang for a crime he did not commit. 3 days. And Lena Mercer Blackburn, who had arrived in this town with 17 cents and not a soul alive who knew her name, was about to show Willow Creek exactly what happened when you cornered a woman who had nothing left to lose. She already knew where to start, with the enemy's own daughter. Lena did not sleep the night they took Silas. She sat at the table in the cabin that smelled of wood smoke and bread and the fading ghost of kerosene drifting up from the black scar on the mountainside where the barn had stood 2 days ago. She sat with her hands flat on the rough surface and her eyes fixed on the door, and she made a plan. Not a plan born from hope. Hope was a luxury she had spent 8 months learning she could not afford. This was a plan born from the same thing that had carried her out of a house in Pennsylvania and through a window into the November dark and across 1,200 miles of hostile country with 17 cents in a dead man's broken watch, and the kind of stubbornness that other people mistake for courage, but is really just the refusal to stop breathing when the world has given you every reason to quit. She had 3 days before the trial. 3 days to take apart a conspiracy built by a man whose guilt had curdled into obsession, and a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying people who did not fit the picture she had painted of how the world should look. She needed cracks. Every wall has them. Every conspiracy is only as strong as the weakest person holding it together. And people Lena had learned in 22 years of watching people closely, because her survival depended on reading them correctly, people are the most unreliable material in the world. She saddled the horse Pearl had left for her and rode the 8 miles into Willow Creek before the sun was fully up. Day 1. She went to Reverend Whitfield. The old pastor sat in his study behind the church, a small room with a desk covered in papers and shelves of books with cracked spines in a single window looking out on the cemetery. He poured coffee and set the cup in front of Lena and sat back in his chair and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that listening was almost always more useful than speaking. "I know what they did," Lena said. She sat across from him with her back straight and her hands still. "They planted those cattle, Garrett Hale and the Ashfords. They framed my husband." Reverend Whitfield nodded slowly. His eyes were kind, but they were not naive. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of human nature up close and at length and had decided to believe in the best anyway, not because the evidence supported it, but because the alternative was despair. And despair was a luxury a man of God could not afford. "I believe you," he said, "but believing and proving are 2 different countries, and the border between them is wide." Then he told her something she had not expected. Before the collar and the Bible and the small white church at the end of Main Street, Samuel Whitfield had been a different man entirely. He had ridden with a bad outfit in the Kansas Territory in the years before the war. He had done things that paced the back of his mind like caged animals. Things he had spent 30 years trying to make peace with and had mostly succeeded, except on certain nights when the wind sounded a particular way and the darkness felt too close and the old Samuel Whitfield stirred in his sleep. "I know how men like Garrett Hale operate," the Reverend said. His voice was calm, but underneath the calm was something forged in the same fires that had once made him dangerous. Fires that God had repurposed for different work but not extinguished. They build a case that looks solid from the outside. Witnesses, evidence, the appearance of due process. But every structure has a load-bearing wall, and every load-bearing wall has a stress point. He leaned forward. You do not need to prove innocence. You need someone on their side to break. Find the weakest joint and put pressure on it. Lena left the church with a strategy taking shape in her mind. Not complete, not yet, but the skeleton was there. The bones of a plan that would require her to do 3 things in 3 days, each one harder than the last, each one depending on the one before it. She needed a witness who would turn. She needed evidence that could not be denied. And she needed to understand her enemy well enough to predict what he would do when the walls started closing. Day 2, she found Rosalind Ashford. The mayor's daughter was coming out of the dressmaker's shop on Main Street at 10:30 in the morning. 20 years old, her mother's features, but none of her mother's hardness, not yet. There was something unfinished about Rosalind Ashford, something still forming, like clay on a wheel that has not yet been fired. She could still become something different from what her mother was shaping her into. But Lena could see that the window for that was closing. Every day that Rosalind spent inside her mother's house, she became a little more like the woman who lived there. A little harder, a little colder, a little more willing to accept that control was the same as love. Rosalind's face went white when she saw Lena step into her path. "Mrs. Blackburn, I cannot talk to you if my mother finds out." "Your mother is not here," Lena said, "and I am not going to waste your time with conversation that does not matter." She stepped closer, close enough that her words would not carry past the two of them, close enough that Rosalind could not look away. "You love Caleb Weston," Lena said. "The wrangler at the Dawson Ranch. You have been seeing him in secret for 6 months." Every drop of color left Rosalind's face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like a woman who had just watched the ground open beneath her feet and was waiting to fall. "How do you know that? It does not matter how I know. What matters is this." Lena kept her voice low and even. Not threatening, not pleading, something between the two. The voice of a woman making an offer that was also, if you turned it the right way, in the light a rope thrown to someone who was drowning. "Your mother has destroyed families in this town. The Sullivans, the freedmen who wanted to buy land, the widow, the laundry family, and now my husband. For the crime of living on a mountain and having a face she does not approve of and loving a woman who does not follow her rules." Rosalind's eyes filled. Her chin trembled. She looked very young, standing there on the boardwalk of a town her mother ran like a personal kingdom. Very young and very frightened and caught between the only world she had ever known and the faint possibility that there might be another one. "I do not need your courage," Lena said. "I need your selfishness. Help me, and I will help you get free of her." The words landed. Lena could see them land, could see Rosalind turning them over the way you turn over a coin to check if it is real. "I know things," Rosalind whispered. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "I have heard things. My mother and Garrett Hale have been meeting. I heard them talking 3 nights ago. Planning. Tell me everything," Lena said. And Rosalind did. Standing in the shadow of the dressmaker's awning with tears running down her face and her hands gripping each other so hard her knuckles went white, she told Lena about the meetings between Cordelia and Garrett in the parlor after the mayor went to bed. About $200 in gold coins taken from her father's safe. About the names of the men Garrett had hired to drive Circle H cattle onto Silas's land under cover of darkness. About her mother's instructions regarding the barn. Burn it, make them afraid, make them want to leave. And then Rosalind told her one thing more, the thing that would matter most in the end. After the barn burned, Garrett turned in the men he hired, gave their names to a deputy in Carter County, told the deputy they were arsonists working alone. He used them to do the good, and then he handed them to the law to cover his own tracks. He throws people away when he is finished with them. Like they are nothing. Lena listened. And as she listened, she felt the architecture of the conspiracy reveal itself. Every room, every hallway, every load-bearing wall, and every stress point. And the biggest stress point of all was not Rosalind. It was not even Cordelia. It was a thin young drifter named Emmett Slade sitting in a saloon somewhere in this town with $50 in his pocket and no idea that the man who paid him considered him disposable. That afternoon, Lena went to the Ashford house. She walked up the front steps of the largest home in Willow Creek and knocked on the door, and when the hired girl answered, she said, "Tell Mrs. Ashford that Lena Blackburn is here, and that I will wait on this porch until she comes out or until the sun goes down, whichever comes first. Cordelia came to the door. Dark blue silk, gray hair perfect, face composed into polite impatience. The expression of a woman interrupted in the middle of something important by something she considered beneath her. Mrs. Blackburn. What a surprise. I doubt that, Lena said. I doubt anything surprises you, which is why I want to make sure you see this coming. She stepped closer. Not into the house, just closer to the threshold. Close enough that her words would not carry past the porch. You think I am another family for you to run out of your valley? Another Sullivan. Another name on the list of people who did not fit and had to go. I ran 1,200 miles to get here, Mrs. Ashford, from a man who locked me in rooms and tried to take everything I had. I did not run from him to be run off by you. I have nothing left to lose, and a woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing on this mountain. You should be afraid of that. Cordelia's mask slipped, longer than it had ever slipped before, and what Lena saw beneath it was not anger or contempt. It was recognition. The same recognition that had flickered across Cordelia's face at the cabin, but stronger now, clearer, as if Cordelia saw in Lena not just an adversary but a reflection, a version of herself from before the loss, before the grief hardened into something that looked like strength, but was really just scar tissue grown so thick it smothered everything underneath. The mask returned, seamless as glass. Good day, Mrs. Blackburn, Cordelia said, and closed the door. Lena turned and walked down the steps. She had not come to win. She had come to make Cordelia understand that the rules had changed, that the woman standing on her porch was not going to disappear the way the others had, that this time the machinery of quiet destruction was going to meet something it had never encountered before. Someone who had already lost everything and discovered that the bottom is not the end. It is a foundation. Day 3. She found Emmett Slade. He was in the saloon. Back table, half-empty glass of whiskey. The look of a man who had recently sold something he could not buy back and was trying very hard not to think about the price. 28 years old, thin and weathered by wind and work and the particular kind of poverty that grinds a person down slowly without the mercy of finishing the job. Lena sat across from him without asking permission. He startled. His eyes darted around the room and came back to her face with the nervous focus of a small animal that has just noticed movement overhead. How much did Garrett Hale pay you to lie? She asked. Slade flinched, looked around, looked back. I do not know what you are talking about. $50, Lena said. That is the going rate for a man's life, apparently. Tell me, Mr. Slade, when they hang an innocent man on your word, will that $50 buy you one night of sleep? He did not answer, but his eyes wavered. Something behind them shifted. Not conscience exactly. Something more animal than that. The instinct of a creature sensing that the ground it is standing on is not as solid as it thought. I am not threatening you, Lena said. I am asking you to think about what you are doing. Silas Blackburn never stole a head of cattle in his life. You know that. Garrett Hale knows that. The only question is whether $50 is worth another man's neck. She stood up. She did not wait for a response because she knew one would not come here. Not now. The seed needed time. Whether it found soil or stone was up to Emmett Slade, and whatever remained of his conscience after years of poverty had stripped away everything that was not essential to survival. She was almost to the saloon door when Slade spoke. He did not look up from his whiskey. His voice barely carried past his own table. $50 does not last long. Lena stopped, did not turn around. No, it does not, but a clear conscience lasts forever. She walked out into the daylight and did not know if it was enough. She did not know if anything she had done in 3 days would be enough. She had a retired gunfighter who wore a collar now, a mayor's daughter who might or might not have the courage to betray her own mother in a public courtroom, and a drifter with a $50 conscience that might hold or might not. It was not much, but it was what she had. And Lena Mercer had built a life out of not much, had crossed half a country on not much, had survived things that should have killed her on not much. And she was not going to stop now because the odds were against her. The odds had been against her since the night she went out a window in Pennsylvania, and they had not stopped her yet. That evening on her way to the jail, she passed the church. The door was open. Inside, in the dimming light, she could see Garrett Hale sitting alone in a pew. His head was bowed, his hands were clasped, and he was talking. Not praying, talking to someone who was not there, someone whose name she could guess. She stood in the doorway and listened, and for the first time she understood something that complicated everything she thought she knew about the man who was trying to destroy her husband. Garrett Hale did not hate her. He hated himself. He had sent his brother into a mine, and his brother had died. And every day since then, he had been trying to fix something that could not be fixed, to atone for something that did not accept atonement. And when Lena refused to be rescued, refused to be the vessel for his redemption, the guilt that had been driving him turned rancid, turned to rage, turned to the conviction that if he could not save her, then no one could have her, especially not a scarred stranger on a mountain who had done nothing to earn her except be kind at the right moment. This did not forgive what Garrett had done, did not excuse the lies or the planted cattle or the burned barn or the conspiracy, but it made it complicated in a way that simple hatred never could. And Lena filed that understanding away because she had learned that knowing your enemy was more valuable than despising him. Despising made you reckless. Understanding made you precise. They gave her 10 minutes with Silas. He was behind bars. His face was bruised from the attention of men who had decided his guilt before the trial began. His bandaged hands were worse than when she had last seen them, the wrappings dirty and dark with old blood, the burns underneath untreated for days in a cold cell. "If tomorrow goes wrong," he said, his voice quiet and steady in the way it always was when things were worst, "promise me you will leave. Take whatever money there is and get on the first stage heading anywhere." Lena looked at her husband through iron bars, the man who had given her a floor to sleep on and a porch to freeze on, who had told her the truth about his dead wife's letter when a lie would have been safer, who had said "I love you" as if the words might kill him, but said them anyway because she asked. "I promise I will burn this whole town to the ground if they touch you," she said. Silas Blackburn, who had been beaten and caged and accused of a crime assembled from lies by men who wanted him erased, who had not smiled in days, looked at his wife through iron bars and smiled. This trial began at 9 in the morning in the Willow Creek Town Hall, a single room with wooden benches and a raised platform for the judge, and an American flag on the wall that had seen better decades. Judge Harrison sat at the front, iron-haired, sharp-eyed, the reputation of a man who was tough but fair and who had limited patience for theater from either side. He had ridden in from the county seat the night before and had spent the morning reviewing the case with the expression of a man who had seen stronger prosecutions in his career, but was willing to let this one stand on whatever legs it had, sitting in his north pasture as if they had every right to be there. The evidence speaks for itself, gentlemen. Emmett Slade took the stand. The thin young drifter walked to the witness chair, placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then in a flat, rehearsed voice that sounded like a man reciting something he had memorized rather than something he had lived, he told the jury he had seen Silas Blackburn driving Circle H cattle across the north pasture 3 nights before the arrest. Said he had been riding through and stopped to water his horse at the creek and witnessed the entire thing from about 200 yards. Lena's heart sank. Her conversation in the saloon had failed. The seed she planted had landed on stone. $50 had purchased this man's word, and there was no refund. The defense lawyer, an older man named Warren, who had taken the case as a favor to Reverend Whitfield, did what he could with what he had. He called Mrs. Patterson, who testified she had heard riders passing through town at midnight heading north toward Silas's property. He called a ranch hand who had seen Garrett meeting with strangers at the saloon. He called Lena herself. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and her voice clear and her eyes on the jury. She testified that Silas had been beside her in the cabin every night and could not have moved 6 head of cattle without her knowledge. The prosecutor stood for cross-examination. "You love your husband, is that correct?" "Of course, and you would say anything to protect him. Would you not tell the truth to protect him?" Lena said. "That is what I am doing now." But the weight of the evidence was tilting the room. She could see it in the jury's faces. The calculation happening behind 12 sets of eyes. The scarred mountain man, the cattle on his land, the convenient new wife. The story was clean and simple and easy to believe, and 12 men from a small town were going to take the easy road because the easy road did not require them to challenge the most powerful woman in Willow Creek. Lena looked at the clock on the wall. 2:17 in the afternoon, time bleeding out. Then the courtroom door opened. Rosalind Ashford walked in alone, uninvited, unannounced, wearing a plain dress with her hair pulled back and her face the color of paper. She looked nothing like the frightened girl Lena had cornered outside the dressmaker's shop 2 days before. That girl had been crying and uncertain and caught between two worlds. This girl had chosen. This girl had made a decision that would burn down every bridge she had ever stood on, and she was walking across the last one with matches in her hand and her chin raised and her mother's eyes watching from the gallery. She walked up the center aisle with quiet, deliberate steps. Every eye in the room tracked her. Every breath stopped. Cordelia Ashford rose from her seat, and her mask cracked. Not in private this time, not in the controlled setting of her own porch or the comfortable distance of a general store. Here, in front of the whole town. Her voice came out sharp and raw and stripped of every layer of honey she had spent 53 years applying. Margaret, sit down this instant. She called her daughter Margaret, the name she used in private, the name that meant obey. Rosalind's voice shook, but it did not break. No, mother. 2 words. The hardest 2 words she had ever spoken. Harder than any testimony she was about to give. Because those 2 words were not about the trial. They were about 20 years of obedience and 20 years of silence and the accumulated weight of every time she had wanted to say no and said yes instead because saying yes was safe and saying no meant losing everything she knew. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, my name is Rosalind Ashford. I would like to testify. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel until the room quieted. The prosecutor objected. The defense requested permission. The judge studied Rosalind for a long moment with those sharp eyes that had seen every kind of witness from the genuine to the rehearsed and had learned to tell the difference. He allowed her to take the stand. Rosalind placed her hand on the Bible, swore, and then she spoke. She told the court about the meetings between her mother and Garrett Hale in the parlor of the Ashford house. She told them about $200 in gold coins removed from her father's personal safe. She told them the names of the men Garrett had hired to move stolen cattle onto Silas Blackburn's property under cover of darkness. She told them dates and times and details with the specificity of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. Storing information carefully and quietly, the way a person stores provisions against a winter they always knew was coming. She told them her mother had ordered the barn burned, that Cordelia had sat in her parlor and said the words make them afraid, make them want to leave, as calmly as she might order a new bolt of fabric from the general store. And then Rosalind told them the thing that mattered most. After the barn was burned, Garrett Hale turned in the men he had hired. He gave their names to a deputy in Carter County, told the deputy they were criminals acting on their own. He used them, and then he threw them away to protect himself. He discards the people who work for him. The courtroom went silent, the kind of silence that has texture and weight. The silence of a room full of people absorbing something that cannot be unheard. Lena looked at Emmett Slade. He was sitting in the gallery, and his face had turned the color of ash. She could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes in real time. Garrett Hale discarded the men who burned the barn, turned them in, used them as instruments, and then snapped them when they were no longer useful. And Slade was sitting in this courtroom as Garrett's remaining instrument, the last piece holding the frame together. If Garrett would betray the men who committed arson for him, he would not think twice about betraying the man who committed perjury. $50, and Emmett Slade was expendable. Slade raised his hand. Your Honor, I need to say something. Judge Harrison looked at him over the rims of his spectacles. The courtroom held its collective breath. Slade stood. He looked across the room at Silas sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table. And something shifted in his face. Not courage. He was not brave enough for courage. What moved across his features was fear. The primal, ancient fear of a man who has just realized that the machine he agreed to be part of will grind him up as readily as it grinds anyone else. Garrett Hale paid me $50 to testify against Silas Blackburn, he said. His voice was flat and quiet and carried through the silent room the way a single stone carries across the surface of still water. Everything I said on the stand was a lie. I never saw Blackburn steal any cattle. I never saw him do anything wrong. He paused. $50 is not worth a man's neck. I am sorry. He sat down. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Lena sat in the front row and did not move, did not eat, did not drink, did not speak. She stared at the closed door of the deliberation room and felt every second of those 40 minutes pass through her body like blood through a vein, each one carrying the possibility that her husband would live or die. Each one stretching and compressing time in ways that made 40 minutes feel like 40 years and also like 40 seconds. The door opened. The foreman stood. Not guilty. Lena did not remember crossing the courtroom. She was in her seat, and then she was in his arms, and he was still wearing handcuffs, but he held her anyway. His face pressed into her hair, saying her name over and over. Lena, 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 as if the sound of it was the only prayer he had left and the only one that had ever been answered. They removed the cuffs, and the first thing Silas did with free hands was take her face in his bandaged palms and look at her. You did this, he said. We did this. No. He shook his head. His eyes were bright and fierce and full of something larger than gratitude and deeper than love. You walked into a church and told a town to choose a side. You turned an enemy's daughter into an ally. You sat across from a man in a saloon and asked him to find his conscience. You did this, Lena. All of it. Garrett Hale was arrested where he stood. Sheriff Dugan crossed the courtroom and put handcuffs on the man who had been certain of his victory an hour before. Conspiracy, perjury. He would be held in the Willow Creek jail until transferred to the territorial prison in Laramie. As they led him toward the door, Garrett turned. His mask was gone. The anger, the control, the self-righteous certainty that he was doing the right thing for his dead brother. All stripped away, and underneath was just a man who had loved his brother and sent him to Dim and could not make peace with that no matter how many miles he traveled or how many plans he made or how many lives he was willing to destroy in the name of atonement. Lena, he called out. His voice broke on her name the way it had broken on his brother's name in the church 3 nights ago. I am sorry. I just wanted to make it right with Thomas. I am sorry. Lena looked at Garrett Hale. She did not forgive him. She was not sure she ever would, but she understood him. She saw the man beneath the wreckage, the brother who carried a guilt so heavy it had crushed everything good in him and left only the desperate need to fix something that was permanently and irreversibly broken. Understanding was its own kind of mercy, not absolution, not pardon, just the acknowledgement that even people who do terrible things are still people, and sometimes that acknowledgement is enough. Rosalind Ashford sat alone in the courtroom after the verdict. Her mother had walked past her. Not a word, not a look, not a dramatic confrontation, just silence. Cordelia Ashford walked past her own daughter as if the girl were a stranger on the street who did not warrant acknowledgement. 20 years of obedience and one act of defiance, and the consequence was erasure. Not anger, something worse. The removal of existence. Lena crossed the room and took her hand. You will stay with us, she said, for as long as you need. 3 days of poultices and careful cleaning and the kind of precise patient work that separates medicine from hope. Lena did not leave his side. She changed the bandages every 4 hours. She kept the fire burning. She spooned broth into his mouth when fever made his hands shake too badly to hold a cup. And she talked to him. Not about anything important. About the chickens. About the way the creek sounded different when ice began forming along its edges. About the hawk she had seen that morning riding thermals above the meadow. She talked to keep him anchored to the world of the living. Because she had seen what happened when Silas drifted into the dark. She had pulled him back from that edge once before on a night in a barn with a whiskey bottle and a fist through a wall. She was not going to let him drift away now. The doctor saved his hands, but 2 fingers on the right lost sensation permanently. The nerves were dead. He could see them move but felt nothing. He dropped cups, fumbled buttons, could not grip the way he used to. For a rancher, hands are everything. Losing feeling in 2 fingers was not a death sentence, but it was a wound that would not heal. A permanent reminder carried in his own body of everything that had happened and the price that had been paid. Lena did not let him sit still long enough to mourn it. She put him to work the moment the doctor cleared him. Small tasks first, feeding chickens, shelling corn, work that forced his damaged hand to function without demanding what it could no longer provide. And while Silas relearned the basic mechanics of his own body, Lena ran the ranch, not helped to run it. ran it, she fed the cattle, mended the fences, negotiated with the trader who came through every 2 weeks. Pearl rode over 3 times a week and taught her what she needed to know. How to read weather in the way mountain grass bends before a storm. How to recognize a sick animal by the angle of its head. How to set a fence post in frozen ground so it would hold when the spring thaw came and the earth shifted. Lena discovered she was good at this. 22 years of believing she was fragile and dependent and suited for nothing beyond the boundaries that other people drew for her. The mountain did not care about any of that. The mountain did not care about propriety or expectation or the opinions of women who wore silk and men who wore badges. It cared about one thing: competence, whether you could do what needed to be done when it needed doing. And Lena Mercer Blackburn could. Rosalind lived with them through the winter. She slept on a pallet by the fire the way Lena had slept on her first night in this cabin. She learned to do things her sheltered upbringing had never prepared her for. The first time she touched a cow, she screamed so loud every chicken in the coop took flight, and Lena laughed until she cried. It was the first time this cabin had held the sound of more than one person laughing. The sound was so unfamiliar to those log walls that the room itself seemed to need a moment to absorb it. But winter was not all laughter. The dark nights were long and the wind did not stop, and Silas grew quieter as the weeks passed. Not angry, just withdrawn. He sat for hours looking at his damaged hand, flexing the 2 fingers he could no longer feel. And Lena could see him sliding into a place she recognized. The place where you begin to believe you are a burden, where the voice in your head starts telling you the people you love would be better off without your weight dragging them down. One night in deep February, she woke and found his side of the bed empty. She found him on the porch, sitting in the freezing dark, staring at the 2 crosses behind the cabin. Moonlight on the frost made the graves glow like something sacred. She sat beside him, said nothing, waited. "Annabelle died because I was not good enough," he said finally. His voice was barely a whisper. "Now you are carrying everything because I am not strong enough. Maybe I am just dragging you down." Lena took his damaged hand, held it in both of hers, felt the 2 numb fingers that could not feel her touch, but were still part of him, still attached, still trying to work. "Do not," she said. "You are not a hero, Silas. You are my husband, and my husband is allowed to be weak." He looked at her, and in the moonlight with the cold cutting through both of them and the graves glowing in the frost, something in his face finally released. Not the grief. The grief would stay. It had become part of him the way the scar was part of his face. Permanent, earned, changing the shape of everything around it. But the guilt, the crushing certainty that he was the cause of every bad thing that happened to the people he loved, that he let go. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. He leaned into her, and she felt him shake. Not from cold, not from rage. He was crying, silent. The way men cry when they have spent a lifetime being told that tears are failure and have to unlearn that lie one painful drop at a time. She held him on the porch in the freezing dark, and she let him break. Because sometimes breaking is the only road to mending. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not stand up. It is sit down beside someone and say you are allowed to fall apart, and I will still be here when you are ready to put the pieces back. Rosalind left in March. She took the stage to Denver with Caleb Weston, the young wrangler whose quiet courage had matched her own. Lena walked her to the gate. "Thank you," Rosalind said, "for showing me what a woman can be." "Go," Lena said, "and do not look back." Rosalind climbed into the wagon and did not look back. Lena watched until the wagon disappeared over the ridge. Then she went inside and made coffee and started the day the way she started every day now, with work, with purpose, with the steady accumulation of small acts that together built a life worth living. Spring came in April with a violence that startled her. One day the mountain was brown and bare, and the next it was exploding. Wildflowers she could not name pushing through thawed earth, green grass running like water down the slopes, the creek behind the cabin swelling with snowmelt and running high and fast and singing. Lena was hanging laundry on the line when she felt it. Not the nausea. She had been ignoring that for a week, telling herself it was the water, the food, anything other than what she knew in the deepest part of herself it actually was. What she felt was certainty, the wordless, bone-level knowledge that comes not from evidence, but from the body itself. She was carrying a child. She stood in the spring sunshine with a wet shirt in her hands and felt terror and joy collide inside her chest. Two forces of equal power meeting head-on and neither one giving ground. She went to Pearl. The older woman took one look at Lena's face and set down her garden spade and said, "Sit down before you fall over." "I think I am pregnant," Lena said. Pearl studied her, then nodded. "You are scared," she said, terrified. "Good. Scared means you know you have something worth losing. Now go home and tell your husband before I have to do it for you." Lena rode back to the cabin and found Silas in the corral working with the lunge rope, practicing his grip with his damaged hand, retraining those two numb fingers to hold and guide. Getting better. Slowly, but better. "Silas." He turned, saw her face, set down the rope. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Lena said. And she told him. He did not celebrate. The color left his face the way it leaves a sky before a storm. Because the last time Silas Blackburn received this news, it ended with a pickaxe in frozen ground and two crosses behind the cabin and 3 years of living death. "This time is different," Lena said. She took his hands, both of them, the good one and the damaged one. "I am not Annabelle. You are not who you were 5 years ago. We have Pearl. We have the doctor. We are going to be all right." Silas stood in the corral with the mountains rising green around them and the creek running bright with snowmelt and the spring sun warm on his scarred face. He looked at Lena. He looked at the cabin they had rebuilt. He looked at the two crosses behind it. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and pulled her against his chest and held her so tight she could feel his heartbeat hammering against her own. And she felt him shake again. Not grief, something that had no word large enough to hold it. "We are going to have a baby," he said into her hair, his voice rough and cracked and full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby," Lena said, "and we are going to be all right." Late summer, Lena carried wildflowers behind the cabin to the two crosses. She laid white and yellow blossoms on Annabelle's grave first, arranged them carefully against the weathered wood. Then she sat down in the warm grass with her hand on her belly where the baby was moving. She was alone. Silas was in the south pasture. Pearl was at her own ranch. The mountain was quiet except for the wind and the creek and the birds. "Thank you," Lena said to the woman in the ground, "for loving him first, for teaching him how to love, for this cabin and this land and everything you built, that I get to live in now. I promise I will take care of him, and I promise our baby will know your name, Grace Annabelle Blackburn." That was the name she had chosen. Not erasure, continuation. Annabelle woven into the new story. A thread of gold running through the fabric of everything that came after. Because the past was not something to be buried or forgotten. It was something to be honored, carried forward, made part of whatever came next. She sat for a long time beside the graves, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in a place where two people lay in the ground. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something larger than pain. The understanding that life is built on loss the way a house is built on earth that holds the bones of everything that lived before. And that the bravest thing you can do is not to pretend the bones are not there. It is to plant flowers above them and let them grow. The baby came in September during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin walls and split the sky with lightning. Pearl served as midwife, calm and efficient and firm. The doctor from the neighboring town stood ready. Silas sat beside Lena for 14 hours and did not leave and did not look away and did not let go of her hand. When the baby came, she came angry, red-faced and screaming and perfect. Dark hair, her father's gray eyes. Pearl lifted her and placed her on Lena's chest, and the baby stopped crying instantly. As if she had found the one place in the world she was meant to be and saw no further reason for complaint. Silas looked at his daughter. This man of scars and silence, who had dug 2 graves behind this cabin, who had spent 3 years disappearing from himself, who had been broken by war and grief and rebuilt by a woman with 17 cents who told him to choose to live. He reached out with his damaged hand, 2 numb fingers and all, and touched the baby's cheek with a gentleness so careful it made Lena's heart ache. "Hello, little one," he whispered. His voice cracked in the middle like ice giving way on a creek in spring. "I am your father, and I promise. I am going to protect you and love you and make sure you grow up knowing how lucky we are that you are here. Grace Annabelle Blackburn, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Born at 9:17 in the evening during the worst thunderstorm Willow Creek had seen in 20 years. A letter arrived that autumn, postmarked from the territorial prison in Laramie. 2 lines in Garrett Hale's handwriting. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want you to know Thomas would be glad you are happy. He always wanted you to smile more." Lena read it, folded it, did not reply, but she did not burn it either. She placed it in the wooden chest beside the baby shoes and the letter to Catherine that was never sent. The past was not erased. It was kept. The pain and the love and the grief and the guilt, stored carefully in a dark chest the way you store seeds through winter, knowing that even the hardest things carry within them the possibility of growth. Autumn evening. Grace was 3 weeks old and sleeping in the cradle Silas had built with his own hands, working slowly and carefully with his damaged fingers, fitting each piece together with the patience of a man who understood that the most important things in this world cannot be rushed. The cabin was warm, fire in the hearth, the smell of bread because Lena baked every Sunday now. On the mantel, a tin cup held late wildflowers. Through the window, the 2 crosses were visible in the fading light, and beside them the flowers she had planted in the spring. Dormant now, waiting for next year. But they would come back. They always came back. Lena sat on the bed, exhausted and happy and sore and filled with a contentment so deep it felt like it had always been there, just waiting for her to stop running long enough to discover it. Silas stood in the doorway watching her. The firelight played across his scarred face and made the jagged line from ear to jaw look like something earned rather than something suffered. Something that said this man has been through the fire and come out the other side still standing. He was smiling, not the guarded, cautious expression she had seen in the early weeks. A full smile, open, the hard-won radiance of a man who had crawled through years of darkness and found light on the other side, and understood for the first time that the light was not a trick. It was real. It was his. He had earned it. Lena looked at him. "Where do I sleep?" she said. Her voice was soft and teasing, her eyes bright with love and mischief and the deep, unshakable knowledge that she already knew the answer. The same question she had asked on that first night, standing in this cabin with nothing but 17 cents and a broken watch and a secret she could not carry alone. Silas crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, reached down and pulled the blanket back. The same gesture from that first night when she was a stranger and he was a ghost. "Right here," he said, but this time he did not walk to the porch. He lay down beside her and pulled the blanket over them both, and Lena curled against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Steady, sure, the beat of a man who had chosen to live and was living. Regular as hammer strikes on wood, as hoofbeats on packed earth, as rain on the roof of a home built with scarred hands. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the grass the way it always had and always would. It passed over 2 graves planted with flowers that would bloom again in spring. It swept past the new barn that Pearl's crew had raised in a single day, while Lena stood in the yard and wept at the kindness of people who had started as strangers and become family. It whispered through the cottonwood trees along the creek where Lena had poured out a bottle of whiskey on a night that felt like a lifetime ago. And inside the cabin in the warm gold light of the fire a baby slept, and a woman breathed, and a man held them both, and the wind could not touch them. The following spring, the flowers on Annabelle's grave bloomed again, and the mountain turned green from base to peak, and a letter arrived from Pennsylvania. 4 words in handwriting Lena recognized the instant she saw it on the envelope. The handwriting of a man she had pushed down a staircase on a November night in another life. "Henry Phelps is alive, and he is coming."